Is my screen visible?
Yes, it is visible.
All right, all right. Thank you. Good evening. We are here for week 4's live session for the NPTEL course on environmental impact assessment. The course instructor is Dr. Harshit Lakra. She is an assistant professor at the Department of Architecture and Regional Planning at IIT Roorkee. We have two of these weekly sessions going on as part of the collaboration between PMRF and NPTEL, where the sessions are taken up by the PMRF scholars, essentially PhD students who have been covered under the Prime Minister's Research Fellowship. Right. So session 1 happens on Saturdays and is taken up by Miss Isha Rathod. One second. Yeah, so she is a PMRF and research scholar at the Department of Architecture and Planning at IIT Roorkee. I'm Monica S. I am a PMRF and research scholar from the Department of Architecture and Regional Planning at IIT Kharagpur. So these sessions we happen every Tuesday from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. We usually address doubts and we have interaction sessions. Like during the session, if you have any query, either after a prompt or even in between, you can always raise your hand on Google Meet. Once I allow you to, you can unmute yourself and raise your query. Or the questions can also be posted in the chat box, which will be addressed during the lecture later. We also have a discussion forum for the course. Any questions related to the live sessions, as well as generally the course, can be raised in the discussion forum. These questions will be addressed either in the discussion forum itself or in the next week's live session. I'll briefly show how to access these two. So every week, so these are essentially called problem solving sessions by NPTEL. So to access the links to all of these, you can just click the problem solving session tab. Once you click the option that pops up, you can click here for the Excel sheet that sort of contains all the links for the resources. These are the recordings of all the sessions by both Ms. Isha and me. And these are the folders where you can find the um, PDFs of the slides for each session. So right now, as of now, we have three. This is our fourth session, so you can just access the link via YouTube. Right, I just thought I'll show that. Going back to the lecture, we'll today we'll have a very short recap of the topics that were covered in week 4, and then we'll look at week 4 assignment questions from the previous round of the course. After that, we'll shortly look at very briefly look at strategic environmental assessment, because the question was raised in a previous lecture. Uh, I was uh, I was under the assumption that excuse me, I was under the assumption that it might be covered in subsequent lectures, but since it wasn't explicitly covered, we'll be taking a small, like a short look at that. And we'll also be looking at a few questions from the current run of the course, since the assignment deadline is actually over. Before we go into the week's course content, does anybody have any queries? Do you have any queries regarding the what was taught in the lecture? All right, so let's just go into the session. If you have any queries at any point, you can raise them. Right, so week 4 was a continuation of uh, the laws, policies, and institutional arrangements for EIA systems. So last week we saw air, and this week we uh, had a few lectures. One was on water, soil, land, and geology. Lecture 7 was on ecology. 16, 17, and 18 was on coastal ecology and geomorphology, 19 was on noise, and 20 was on ecosystem services. So lecture 16 briefly covered key concepts of water, and then we looked at key legislation, guidance, and standards for water. Under soil, land, and geology as well, we looked at key legislation, guidance, and standards. So then in lecture 17 on ecology, we looked at international and multilateral agreements and conventions, national and regional legislation, codes of practice and best practices, and special interest groups. Right? So in lecture 18, which was laws, policies, and institutional arrangements for EIA systems pertaining to coastal ecology and geomorphology, we had coastal ecology and geomorphology's context and authorities that are associated with it. We had took a look at global agreements, coastal and marine biodiversity, governance and policy frameworks for coastal and marine contexts, biodiversity and protected areas in India, as well as policies and guidance. In lecture 19 pertaining to noise, there was an outline of international level legislation, guidance and standards, standards and guidelines for measuring and assessing noise and vibration, and national noise level policy and guidance. Right. Lecture 20 pertaining to ecosystem services provided a background on ecosystem services, international arrangements and policy objectives, national ecosystem services policy in the Indian context, examples of initiatives related to ecosystem services in India, international examples of ecosystem services policy and legislation, international financial institutions, and guidance on integrating ecosystem services in ESLA. Right. So let's move on to the previous runs week for assignment questions and a few explanations and discussions of them. So as I move into the questions, I would request you to post what you think the answers are for each question so that we can have an interactive session. Question 1. State true or false. Standards IS 10500-2012 in India provides permissible and desirable limits for various parameters of drinking water. Is it true or false? Okay, so let's look at the question again. So this is the standards name, right? So what does the question says it provides? It provides permissible and desirable limits for various parameters of drinking water. So from the slides, if you recall, this is indeed true. So we have the BIS drinking water specifications, which give these exact parameters, right, for drinking water. So the answer is true. Right? Any queries regarding this? You just need to remember the standards code. Right. Moving on. So state true or false. UNESCO global geoparks are important for the conservation, protection, and management of their fossils, stratigraphy, minerals, or other geological interests. Is it true or false? If we have one answer in the chat box, okay, we have two answers, two opposing answers. The answer is actually true. So let's take a look at. So this is where these are the slides that deals with this global geoparks um, program, right? So the answer is actually true. They are actually indeed important for the conservation, protection, and management of their fossils, stratigraphy, minerals, and other geological interests. So these are all essentially sites of geological interest. Let's take a closer look at geological sites and what they sort of mean. So these areas are spots in the world which have been identified by UNESCO as part of this program, UNESCO Global Geoparks Program, also known as the Global Geoparks Network. So they sort of posit that learning from one geopark or one instance can sort of help, other instances as well. Therefore, it's called the Global Geopark Network. So there are a couple of them. If you take a look at it, you will sort of understand what these are. So this one is in Vietnam. It's called the Non Ngoc Cao Bang Geopark. So it has a highland tropical monsoon climate and two distinct wet and dry seasons. So it has a rich biodiversity with widespread forests, endemic faunas, floras, herbs, and specialty crops. So you see the richness of biodiversity here. Right. It also has a very complex drainage network that sort of includes five major river systems and 47 lakes. So, sorry, the order of slides is actually messed up. One second. Yeah, so this is actually located in the northern border province of Cao Bang. Right, so this was recognized as a second site in Vietnam after Dong Van Karst Plateau. Right, so this was in 2010. So this is Vietnam, and then the capital city Hanoi is here, and this is the province of Cao Bang, right? So it sort of covers six districts, so it's a huge area actually. And it was established in 2015 as a geopark, right? First of all, these are known as karst landscapes. Okay, so there's the number of uh, transformations of geological configurations that you find in this particular site, they are considered as a vivid illustration for the Earth's evolution and changes, right? How it has changed over the time. So they are sort of preserved in various states across this entire area. And this is why it's a very, very important geological site, right? It apart from which it also hosts a variety of biodiversity, like we saw. It also has many renowned cultural and tourism heritage sites. It is home to several minority ethnic groups, right? So these are some of the important cultural and heritage sites as well that are included in this vast area, right? So this is one example of how the geological configuration is important due to its drainage, due to its landscape uh, format, which sort of gives us an idea of, the evolution of Earth itself. So it's that important. Another site that's again very interesting is Izu Peninsula in Japan. So if you notice, there's the sea here, and then there are mountainous regions or hills here, plus volcanic sites. So there are several volcanic sites actually. So because of the sudden protrusion of mountains from the sea, the region faces heavy rainfalls, and it also has a diverse coastal topography. So it is also the only place in the world where two active volcanic arcs collide. So what are these volcanic arcs? So I'm just going to move this slide here and come back to it later. So what are these volcanic arcs? So you see this one arc here. So volcanoes are actually located along certain formations, plateau formations. So and these are known as volcanic arcs. So these are basically between tectonic plates, right? So they say there is one tectonic plate, and there is another tectonic plate here. This junction is supposed to have a higher number of volcanoes than the rest. Mostly because there is a, if you see, so this one is a tectonic plate. This is a tectonic plate. At this junction, we have this gap through which it's like a fracture on the surface of the earth, through which magma from uh, subsurface comes out, right? So we have two of these arcs. One is this one, and the other is this one, and it's sort of located at the junction of these two arcs. Right? So that's the Izu Peninsula. Izu Peninsula has a lot of these volcanoes. Some of them are dormant. So that being said, let's take a look at the submission that they had made for. So what happens is the national government or some form of organization within the country sort of makes the case as to why a particular site should be a geopark, right? So this was Izu Peninsula's application to be a UNESCO Global Geopark. As you see, it has been successful. They start by giving a very basic outline as to what is the situation here ecologically, biodiversity wise, population, climate, etc. But they start talking about what kind of provisions have been done at the level of the country itself to preserve such a geological site of importance. Then they also establish the geological heritage. So this is the highlight, right? So why is it an important geological site? That needs the UNESCO needs to be convinced of this importance, right? So they start highlighting. If you, as you can see, there are a lot of these volcanoes in this region, right? So then they sort of trace as to how this Izu Peninsula captures the evolution of Earth's formations. Then they go on to more technical details. So that's sort of a comprehensive document as to what are the formations, what all efforts have been made, and why it should be a geopark, and leading to its conservation, right? So if you want to take a look at the all the sites that are there, so UNESCO sort of hosts them on its website, right? So this is another interesting site. It's called Dining UNESCO Global Geopark. So you can see how it need not be just purely geological. There can be overlaps of human value as well. So what are the ways in which geological heritage or geological sites are sort of preserved across the world? So there are three routes to recognition or protection of these sites. So one is national designation, when the country decides at the national level, saying, okay, you know what, this one is a very important site for us, and we're going to go ahead and protect it. Sort of like the Geological Survey of India does that at a national scale in India as well. Similar to Archaeological Survey of India, preserving places of archaeological importance. Or the second level is it can be considered a geopark, which is what we saw. So these are called the Global Geopark Network. The third option is to be recognized as a World Heritage Site. So World Heritage Sites are not necessarily just cultural sites or natural sites. They can also be geological formations. Okay, so while this is for protection, there are two major approaches to inventory. So we sort of make a global list of things, right? So these two programs are the uh, inventory approaches. So one is this one, the Geoparks program. The other is also mentioned in the lecture as the Geosites program. Right? So when it comes to India, there have been three major proposals to the UNESCO saying, okay, you know what, can you please recognize these as geoparks of global importance? So one is the Lonar Lake in Maharashtra, which is an ancient lake created by a meteorite strike. The second is St. Mary's Island and Malpe Beach in Karnataka. So these were all made in subsequent years. Right? So these are a set of four small islands that are formed of columnar rhyolitic lava. So these formations are what are important. So the third one is Erramati Dibalu in Vishakhapatnam. They have red sediment mounds. So recently, in 2020, this Lonar Lake. So you can see this one. This is the meteorite hit turning into a lake. It was chosen as a Ramsar site, right? So and consider which is for the protection of wetlands. we have these are the St. Mary's Islands, and these are the formations that are considered to be important. These are some sort of basaltic formations, and this is Eramati Dibulo in Vishakhapatnam. So it's actually quite ancient, and it's one of the 34 notified National Geological Heritage Monument sites in India. So this is what I was talking about. At the national level as well, we can have these geological sites of importance. So India is trying to get another entry into, like, its first entry into UNESCO Global Geopark, and this time it's a site in Madhya Pradesh, right? So um, it's called Bagh, and it's the oldest dinosaur site in Asia to have been uncovered. So this is where they're expecting dinosaurs with key Indian ancestry to be found. Right? So this is right now being prepped for submission to UNESCO Global Geoparks Report. Right? So apart from this, as we saw, the parallel mechanism is the World Heritage Convention, and it's the heritage list. Right. So the World Heritage Convention happened in 1972, and they sort of recognize sites of outstanding universal value, sort of defined as cultural and or natural significance, which is so exceptional as to transcend national boundaries and to be of common importance for present and future generations of all humanity. So it's to be of common importance. As such, the permanent protection of this heritage is of the highest importance to the international community as a whole. The committee defines the criteria for the inscription of properties on the World Heritage List. So, in particular to geology and geomorphology on the World Heritage List, so there are several criterion based on which a site can be recognized as, a World Heritage Site. So, criterion 8 particularly deals with the geological criterion. So, these have to be outstanding examples representing major stages of Earth's history, including the record of life, significant ongoing geological processes in the development of landforms, or significant geomorphic or physiographic features. So, this is the criterion to enter the World Heritage List. So, it can either enter directly based on criterion 8, or it can enter indirectly as well based on other criteria, but it can, which might also end up having geological or morphological value, right? So, any questions regarding this? This is just a bit of general information to give you a bit of background as to how this works. Any queries? So, moving on to the next question. Match the SDGs mentioned in, which is Sustainable Development Goals mentioned in Group A with their respective themes in Group B. So we have SDG 2, 12, and 15, and the corresponding themes are given. Any responses? You can even give me like individual matchings, as in P1 or P2. Don't worry about giving the wrong answer, because I mean it doesn't matter. It's just to help you recall some of the things that you've gone through in the lectures. Okay, we have a couple of varied answers. So let's see what the answers are, right? So let's see, Sustainable Development Goal 2 is about zero hunger, right? So that will be our option. So SDG 2 sort of deals with end hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. So 12 is responsible consumption and production, right? So, so ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. And 15 is life on land, which actually talks about ecosystems and forests, combating desertification, halt and reverse land degradation, and halt biodiversity loss. So that's P1, Q3, and R2, right? So that's the answer. Answer is C. Any queries? Okay, let's move on to the next question then. State true or false. India is not a signatory of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Is it true or false? So you'll have to answer based on India is not a signatory. Any responses? Okay, let's see what the lecture says. So the CBD happened in 1992, and India is in fact it became a party in Feb 1994, and it is a signatory of the Convention on Biological Diversity. In fact, if you note, quite a lot of efforts have been taken in India towards CBD, some of which we'll actually take a look at later in the session, right? So the answer is actually false. So India is actually a signatory of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Any queries? Let's move. Yeah. Uh, yes. Is there a question? All right. So let's move on to the next question. Which of the following provide key codes of practice? Key codes of practice related to ecology. So one is performance standards from IFC. The next is European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So IFC is the organization. So EBRD, or third option is Asian Development Bank, ADB, and fourth option is African Development Bank, AFDB. Which of these provide key codes of practices related to ecology? Any answers? Okay, we have one answer, and technically you're partially correct. So IFC does give performance standards, right? So we have these performance standards on environmental and social sustainability by IFC, which is the International Finance Corporation. But actually, all of them end up giving key codes of practice related to ecology. So the basis is that all of these organizations actually sort of lend money, right? Like that they perform they loan money for development projects, etc. So all of the with the current movement towards sustainable development, what has happened is most investments have also tried to, someone needs to ensure compliance, or someone needs to ensure that projects are actually environmental friendly or sustainable in their nature. So most banks or most agencies that are into investments and lending towards development have moved towards giving certain standards or goals or requirements that organizations to need to that need they need to meet in order to be able to take money from them. So the practice is, okay, if I'm Asian Development Bank, you need money from me for a project, you have to make sure you follow certain, guidelines or certain minimum requirements for me to be able to invest in you. So that's the concept. That's why almost all major multilateral lending organizations usually have some form of environmental clause also. So if you from several slides in the lectures, you'll see that performance standards have these 8 major documents, right? Uh, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development also has these requirements. They're called performance requirements. So they have an environmental and social policy that they keep releasing. They have released for several years. There's one for 2019 as well, actually. So, and these usually list a set of performance requirements that projects or organizations need to meet in order for EBRD to be able to loan them money. So the focus has shifted towards sustainability and over the years. This is the 2019 report's list of performance requirements, right? So you can see labor and working conditions, biodiversity conservation and sustainable management of living natural resources, indigenous people, cultural heritage. So it's both for environmental and social sustainability, right? So we'll also see other banks such as Asian Development Bank has these environment safeguards, a good practice source book. Right? So these are like recommendations. So therefore, you can see how these are key codes of practices. Is there a question?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Can I go to the previous slide
This
uh,
one,
before this one?
this one.
Yes.
Yeah,
Here you told that environmental and social policy.
right.
So, is environmental and social policies are similar, or how they are relevant? Because environment, as far as my knowledge,
Mm,
environment is concerned is environment and the surroundings,
mm,
whereas social concern the community.
right. So,
Now the
mm,
policy covers the both, or how? What is the scope or the dimension? Could you please just give an enlight
okay.
briefly?
Yeah. So basically, usually the original approach was to look at the environment, right? So if you remember our blue agenda and green agenda, for example. So sorry, green agenda and brown agenda, sorry. They started off with saying, okay, you know what, we need to preserve the environment, we need to do this, we need to save our natural resources. That was going on one side, and social policies towards betterment of people, betterment of their lives, the social systems was going on. But at some point, I think we sort of realized that these two are heavily interdependent on each other. So even if an organization says, okay, you know what, I will focus on environmental preservation, there will be overlaps on, social side. For example, the key example that I can think of right now is indigenous people. So we are not just talking about preserving their environment, no, but they're also crucial towards preservation of nature. A lot of these indigenous peoples, these communities sort of take care of vast stretches of forest that are not possible by communities that do not have knowledge of how to preserve these environments, right? So they are, yes, they are different. This sort of takes care of the nature part, and this sort of takes care of the human part, but there are heavy overlaps, right? That being said, so this environmental and social policy document is actually a document for the conduct of EBRD. So EBRD is saying, this is my policy, this is how I will behave, and this is what I'm thinking of doing. Like, this is my stand towards the environment and society, right? So this is just one part of it. The performance requirements is one component of this. And here also you can see how they are, like, for example, labor and working conditions are more towards the social side of it. Whereas, say, biodiversity conservation and sustainable management of living natural resources is towards the environmental side of it. But society is not going to sustain without environment being taken care of as well, right? So they're interdependent. That's, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, ma'am. But sometimes I think that the what policy in addition to these acts, if there is any special act on this.
So this one, so I'll show you the documents that we will be able to.
Yeah, if there is any additional document also
So
where.
this policy is actually a corporate policy. So like this is for their organization itself, right? So they're saying this is how I will behave. These are my principles. Like you might say, okay, you know what, I come from such a family where we value charity, for example. So this is what I will do. Or you say, okay, I want to do this. I want to be environment friendly. I will do, recycling at my house. So each one's uh, policy or their way of life changes, right? So this is their corporate policy. It's not a policy to be followed by others. This is for them. So if you look at it, see EBRD's roles and responsibilities, their commitments. So these are requirements that they're setting for people who are going to borrow from them. So they're saying if you want to be associated with us, you need to meet these standards. So that's their way of making sure others are also, falling in line. I hope that clears what this policy is, right?
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So all of these codes that we're talking about in the question, yeah. So all of these codes of practices essentially are similar. So these performance standards are IFC's way of saying you need to meet these standards. Similarly, Asian Development Bank, AFDB, they all have, a set of guidelines as to, okay, you do these things, I will lend you money more easily. Or probably they'll incentivize slightly differently. You do more of these environmental things, I'll lend you money at a cheaper rate. Like you can get money at a lower interest rate. So that's how it works. All right. Moving on to the next question. The Royal Society for the Protection of Birds (RSPB) in the UK is an example of special interest group. Is it true or false? Any answers? Okay, we have one answer, and you are right. The answer is true. So this was mentioned in the slide on special interest groups. So the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, the UK, and Audubon Society in the US are like very significant special interest groups. Right? So the answer is true. So special interest groups need not be NGOs alone. So there can be other organizations as well. But NGOs are also special interest groups, right? All NGOs, they have some form of special interest, so to say. So these are some of the major environmental NGOs in India. So of which the Bombay Natural History Society is extremely significant. I mean, I think it's from 1883. Uh, they are they have multi-pronged work towards research. They have their own journal and publications. They have action based programs. They have several programs that are going on within the BNHS society. Another significant organization that I've previously spoken about in one of the sessions is Center for Science and Environment. They uh, issue a number of reports and a number of. They have this magazine called Down to Earth. Apart from which, we have the State of Environment reports, if you remember. All of these are issued by this. So all of their special interest is essentially the environment, right? So, moving on to the next question. Match the Indian institutions mentioned in Group A with their responsibilities in coastal areas in Group B. So we have the following institutions: Ministry of Environment and Forests, Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas, Ministry of Defense, particularly the Indian Coast Guard. So these are particular to coastal areas, right? Any answers? Again, you can give me partial answers. So, okay, let's see. So this is the slide which sort of covers all the organizations or institutions in India responsible for decision making when it comes to coastal areas, right? So, particularly if we see the Ministry of Environment and Forests has a responsibility of management of resources in the coastal water nodal ministry with major responsibility for protecting the marine environment. Includes implementation of legislative measures. So this is very important. So for P, the option is 4, if you see, right? For the Ministry of Agriculture, it's the development of fisheries, aquaculture, and fish processing. So Q is 3. Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas, uh, here it is. So they are involved in offshore installations, coastal refineries, pipelines, etc. So R is 1. And Ministry of Defense or Indian Coast Guard, they are responsible for pollution response measures, including oil pollution. Again, if you remember from last, I think it was last to last session, so I'm not sure, one of the sessions previously done, we had oil spills in Chennai that were sort of cleared up by the first response was from the Indian Coast Guard, apart from, of course, the localites themselves. Right? So the Indian Coast Guard is responsible for pollution response measures. So P4, Q3, R1, and S2. So the answer is C. Any queries? I think it's a matter of remembering these organizations and what they're responsible for. Right? All right. So moving on to the next question. Match the terms in Group A with their description in Group B. So we have 4 of these protection areas: sanctuaries, national parks, conservation reserve, and community reserve. And what do they pertain to? Any responses? Again, partial answers are also welcome. Okay, let's take a look at this. So these are the slides that are sort of pertaining to the answer. So sanctuaries are for the purpose of protecting, propagating, or developing wildlife or its environment. The areas having adequate ecological, faunal, floral, geomorphological, natural, or zoological significance can be declared as sanctuaries. Right. So that's an example of a sanctuary. National parks are areas of ecological, faunal, floral, geomorphological, or zoological association or importance for protecting, propagating, or development wildlife or its environment. Right. So I know it's a very subtle difference, right? But you will have to remember this. Unfortunately, this is sort of based on the statements that have been given. So the differences are actually quite vivid, but the statements are sort of directly lifted from uh, legislation. So that's the reason why they are so closely worded, right? So conservation reserves are essentially areas which are owned by the state government and are adjacent to or linked to protected areas, right? And community reserves are the same, which but the ownership is private. So the answer is actually D. So both of you are correct, right? So let's take a little bit of a closer look at these things so that you can sort of remember these. Yes, you'll have to almost mug up those words, but going beyond that, let's see what is happening here. So there are two major terminologies that are around. One is sites of conservation importance, right? If you remember, there are words like tiger reserves, elephant reserves. These are words again that we hear quite so often, like Ramsar wetland sites, uh, natural world heritage sites, etc. And then there are protected areas of India, right? So national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, conservation reserves, community reserves. These four were part of the question right now, but it also includes marine protected areas, right? So, what are these sites of conservation importance? These are areas of notable environmental or historical interest or importance, which is protected by law against undesirable changes. So, the amount of change that is happening here is extremely restricted, right? You cannot, like, you go in and change the environment here, you are bound to be legally punished. So, it's illegal to modify these environments. So, it's the highest level of protection that is there, right? So these are concerned by varying levels of legal protection. So they can specify as to what is changing here, right? But these are different from protected areas in this sense. Protected areas are those in which human occupation or at least the exploitation of resources is limited. Mind the word limited, right? It's not completely ruled out. So focusing more, like although these two are very different, there are overlaps between these, right? Like some sanctuaries might have reserves in them. Like it's they are not so. For us, they might not actually. We might think, oh, this area is a reserve. How can it be inside the sanctuary? That's not how it works, right? So these might end up being like overlapping in a particular area. That way, then the higher legal authority sort of takes charge, right? So in protected areas of India, these areas are those in which human occupation or at least the exploitation of resources is limited, as we saw. So this is determined based on IUCN's categorization guidelines for protected areas. There are several kinds of which they all vary by the level of protection. So this is to give you an idea of how much area is sort of covered under each of these. So delving more into what exactly these are. So the key point in this entire thing is the national park is a form of protected area which is strictly reserved for betterment of wildlife and biodiversity. It has much higher levels of restriction in terms of human entry and no human activity. Mind this word, no human activities like permitted. You cannot forage, you cannot permit grazing, cultivation, or any sort of collection of firewood. So, if you remember again, there is a Rights Act, which sort of permits that indigenous groups can, perform basic foraging and stuff. But even those are not allowed within national parks, so they are extremely protected. Then wildlife sanctuaries are the next level of protection. So it's a naturally occurring geographic entity that safeguards wildlife and provides species protection from poaching, hunting, predation. So the extreme human activities are protected against. However, some human activities are allowed inside wildlife sanctuaries, such as grazing and collection of forest produce. So this is allowed. So it may be separately existing entity or it can also stand within a national park. Like I said, so these can be in the same place, right? Or close to each other. Then there have also been instances where wildlife sanctuaries have been upgraded into a national park. Conservation reserves are actually, it's like a form of buffer zone or a migration corridor between established national parks. So these buffer zones are actually placed around a national park or a wildlife sanctuary or some other form of reserve or protected forest, wherein so these are government owned and these are going to, like, you are going to allow economic activity here, but they are going to be mildly protected. Like you can't make major changes that is going to endanger the nearby uh, national parks or wildlife sanctuaries or reserves. Community reserves are when it's a privately owned land or a community, not necessarily by an individual. It can also be community owned. But so these are also buffer areas, but they are sort of owned by the community. So this also includes migration corridors. So say there is a national park here and there is a wildlife sanctuary here and there is a settlement here. We might actually end up restricting development along a certain corridor, right? Say it's government owned. It might be inhabited also, but uh, the development will be highly restricted or the development will sort of be arrested. So it also depends on what kind of reserve it is, right? A conservation reserve or a community reserve. restriction will be on a case by case basis. So these are the locations of major national parks and wildlife sanctuaries in India, just to give you an idea. So there have been several reports that the extent of protected areas is not enough, right? So for like almost 5% of our total land area is coming under protected areas. But you can see how several Schedule 1 species are highly protected species, right? They are all outside these reserves or outside the protected areas, which poses a problem because these are under threat of endangerment or extinction, and they're not actually being protected, right? So, yeah, any queries here? That's just to sort of give you an idea. That being said, you will have to remember these uh, statements exactly. So, I hope that clarifies what these four are. Okay, moving on to the next question. State true or false. World Health Organization (WHO) gives noise guidelines based on health parameters for specific environments. True or false? So the keywords here being noise guidelines based on health parameters for specific environments. Right? Any answers? There's one answer. Any others? Okay. There are two answers, and both of you are right. So they do provide guideline values based on the specific environment. So if it's an outdoor living area, what is the decibel level? So for different areas, for a hospital, how is it changing? So the guidelines are very specific. The answer is true. Right? So let's look at one more question before we go for a break. Uh, Question number 11. Match the IFC performance standards, or PS as we call them, mentioned in Group A with their themes in Group B. Again, you'll have to remember the themes and the corresponding PSs. Any responses? Okay, let's see what each one is. So these are our 8 standards, right? So PS1 is dealing with risk management. So that will be assessment and management of environmental and social risks and impacts. Right? So PS2. The second one will be labor, or rather, third one is resource efficiency. Sorry. So Q is 3, resource efficiency and pollution prevention. And performance standard 6 is biodiversity. Right? So P is 2, Q is 3, and R is 1. So the answer is 8. Any queries? I think that's again straightforward. You need to remember all the 8 of them, at least the keywords, so that you can, sort of match. All right, before we go for the next question, let's take a short 5-minute break. Let's 6:59. Let's make it 7:05. Right? we have a 5-minute break currently. We'll be resuming the session at 7:05. All right, let's resume the session. Moving on to the next question. Under Protection Act 1986, which of the following rules, standards CPCB provides for noise? Noise limits for vehicles and airports, noise limits for generators, firecrackers, noise rules, or WHO guidelines or rules. Which of these are rules or standards that are provided by CPCB for noise? Any responses? Okay. Okay, all of you are correct. So these are the slides from the lecture. So talking about the rules for noise under EPA, right? So here we see that firecrackers are sort of covered under Schedule 1 of EPR. So the Environment Protection Rules 1986 were released uh, under the EPA, right? So then we also see Noise Pollution Control Rule 2000, looking at industrial, commercial, and residential areas. Uh, it also specifies vehicles and airports as well. You see this, right? And generators were also mentioned by ma'am during the lecture, right? So all of these three are covered under the standards only. So WHO guidelines are taken only as that guidelines. They're not actually legally enforceable in India. Any queries? All right. Moving on to the next question. Match the theme in Group A with their description in Group B. So Group A has excuse me, three themes: gross ecosystem product GEP, access and benefit sharing ABS, or payment for ecosystem services PES programs. Any answers? Partial answers are also welcome. Okay, we have one answer. Any other responses? Okay, you are right, Ms. Ananta. That's the answer, right? So these are the slides that are sort of pertaining to these three concepts. So gross ecosystem product is actually the value of final ecosystem goods and services supplied to human well-being in a region annually, right? So it can be measured to include natural ecosystems such as forest, grassland, wetland, desert, freshwater, and ocean, and artificial systems that are based on natural processes like farmland, pastures, aquaculture farms, and urban cleanland, right? So I'm also specifies how they, this approach has been taken up in China, right? So access and benefit sharing is a system in which genetic resources may be accessed and benefits resulting from their use shared the uses with countries that provide them, right? And PAS was mentioned as part of this slide on Brazil's uh, Amazonas droughts, right? So so the answer is C, right? So PAS is market-based approaches used to incentivize conservation-related activities. So let's take a closer look at all of these three, right? So the global ecosystem product actually was evolved in China, right? So we have We sort of measure the economy and its status using GDP. For society, we use the Human Development Index, right? However, there was a gap that how do we evaluate nature and ecosystems, right? So that's how the GEP was sort of formed, right? So there is an overlap between GDP and GDP. It's not, they're not mutually exclusive. So GDP will sort of take into account aspects like mining, manufacturing, construction, transportation, and storage, uh, information and communication, wholesale and retail trade, financial insurance and real estate service, public administration, and other such services. Uh, and GEP, the environment aspect of it, gross ecosystem product, will include services like water retention, flood mitigation, soil retention, sandstorm prevention, pollination. So, what is the country's potential for all of these, right? Capacity for all of these: carbon sequestration, mental health, air purification, water purification, climate regulation. These are all some of the examples. And then in the overlapping area, we can see how agriculture, forestry, fishing, recreation, and tourism, hydropower, while they are already being calculated towards GDP, there are certain aspects that are already being calculated, yes, but there are certain others that might not be. And some of these aspects might actually be part of, like, pertaining to ecosystem services per se, right? So even within ecosystem services, uh, if you remember, there are these three types of services, right? Provisioning, regulating, and cultural ecosystem. This is just a graphic to sort of illustrate these. Moving on to access and benefit sharing. So let's take a slightly closer look at this. Right? So what does this mean? First of all, there are genetic resources within the environment, right? So we have both in situ genetic resources like found within ecosystems and natural habitats, and we have ex situ. So say they're not actually in their natural habitats, we go and take them and keep them in botanical gardens or in university collections or somewhere. They might either of the two places, right? Uh, these sort of are going to be with these people. They are called providers, right? They are either states having sovereign rights over natural resources, but not just the state, but also competent national authorities in these states, which grant users access to these resources, right? However, the prime aspect in ABS is this traditional knowledge part, right? When there are local natural resources or some sort of you know uh, particular biodiversity elements or genetic resources in total, their presence and how to sort of utilize these resources or harvest their potential is part of traditional knowledge. Say there is an indigenous community that is living in that area, or some form of local knowledge that is present. So this knowledge is also present in the environment, and usually what happens is some sort of MNC sort of takes these, uh, say they send some person on field, or even otherwise they get to know about these resources, and they end up taking them, they commercialize them, and they sort of end up utilizing their benefits, right? So what happens is usually this traditional knowledge is exploited, and they make money of it, they make profit of it, or some form of profit. It can be commercial, say biotechnology, horticulture, pharmaceuticals, or it can be non-commercial also, say we are looking at research, conservation, or some form of taxonomy, right? So the users sort of put them to these kinds of uses. They are usually researchers, universities, industries. Industries are primarily those that are putting it to majorly commercial uses, right? What happens is the profit that comes out of these ventures are stopped with the users, right? They usually it sort of stops here. What happens in access and benefit sharing is there is a need a better color. There is a feedback mechanism that is taken. So when you gain from these resources that you're gaining, from a particular country's people and its natural resources, you're supposed to be sharing these back to the country, and they will hopefully be sharing it back to the people who are actually, possessing this traditional knowledge, or are guardians of some sort of this genetic resource. Right? So this is the access and benefit sharing. So you provide access through two parts. One is prior informed consent, whether the state wants to share the natural resource, or if the people want to share their indigenous knowledge, that needs to be there. Consent needs to be there, and mutually agreed terms. It should not be one sided or exploitative from the user's side. The local people or the state should also gain equal advantage of these things, right? So that's sort of the concept of access and benefit sharing. So after these, this basically comes under CBD as well, Convention on Biological Diversity, as well as the Nagoya Protocol, which is under CBD only. So the Nagoya Protocol is sort of the latest protocol, which ensures that ABS is sort of followed between countries. However, it has seen a very limited impact until now. In fact, these numbers are internationally recognized certificates of compliance. So compliance as in they have actually made sure this ABS has happened, right? So these data is for 2015 to 2022. Uh, these are the claims. So you see that India has a very disproportionate share of such applications. In fact, that is what I was talking about. Under the Convention on Biological Diversity, India has showed, like, you have several aspects of it, including having protected areas, reserves. India has shown a lot of interest in carrying forward this particular aspect, access and benefit sharing. Right? So, however, although the number is so high, there have been mixed um, implementation on the ground. One major example is in 2007. So this was before the Nagoya Protocol was even signed. So 2007, PepsiCo India Holdings Private Limited paid the Tamil Nadu Biodiversity Board 3.7 million rupees to access a species of exotic seaweed. Right. So this is a picture of the seaweed. So this is being cultivated by local communities in southern Tamil Nadu. So even though this payment was made, uh, these have not reached the beneficiaries, as in the people who are actually cultivating have not gotten it. If you remember, this particular link is missing in this particular case, right? So the implementation is very dicey. This is another example. So there is this Kani tribe in southern Kerala. They have knowledge of this particular herb, which is supposed to have anti-fatigue properties. So what happened was, this was in 1987, which means this was before the Convention on Biological Diversity, right? So Jawaharlal Nehru Tropical Botanic Garden and Research Institute, they got to know about this herb, and they sort of took a group of these tribals from some villages on board. And what they did was they instituted a trust in their favor so that they also get some of the benefits that could accrue. And they went on to develop this drug called Jeevani. However, what happened was, the tribals from other villages, they were not, who were not consulted, they disagreed to it. So because of this and several other issues, Jeevani never hit the market, right? So the trust is gone, and they never marketed the drug. So this is another. This is of course pre CBD, but nonetheless, this is a case of how access and benefit sharing was not done. So even though this clause is present, even though so many people are claiming to have, complied with ABS norms, whether it actually has happened is a huge question, right? So that's just some uh, intro on ABS. When it comes to payment for ecosystem services, so ecosystem services are services that are like water quality, ensuring water quality, or making sure there is enough water. They say there is a group of farmers, or again, the best example is indigenous people who are living upstream. along this river, right? They are ensuring water quality, water quantity, erosion reduction, or they're ensuring carbon capture because they're preserving the forests. There is a bit of habitat conservation that's happening, right? So these people sort of make sure that all of this is available for the city dwellers who are living downstream, right? Who are using all these resources. However, they usually do not pay back for all of these. So PES is a system where they pay in some sort of cash or in kind or materials or some sort of payback happens. This mechanism is called PES, payment for ecosystem services. Right? So that's just to give an idea of these three terms. Any queries? The basic idea is that such a background will sort of help you retain more information than usual, so that it's easier to identify answers in an MCQ. All right, let's move on to the next question. So this is again on the Nagoya Protocol, right? The Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing aims at fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources, including by appropriate access to genetic resources and by appropriate transfer of relevant technologies. Is it true or false? Okay, so the Nagoya Protocol is actually this one. It is true, right? So this is the aim of both access. So this is a form of benefit sharing, right? So this is sort of the timeline of how the Nagoya Protocol came in. So 1992, the Convention of Biological Diversity is open for signature, right, at the Earth Summit. In 1993, it is ratified and comes into force 29th December. So ratification means a minimum number of parties have to say yes. Okay, this is good for any convention or any such document or policy to sort of come into effect. So the CBD is ratified, and meaning a certain minimum number of parties have signed on it, signed up for it. Right. So in 1998, a panel of experts is established to clarify principles and concepts related to access and benefit sharing because it was, mildly complicated in itself. So 2000, we see that COP has an open-ended working group on ABS, right? And so on and so forth till 2010. So Nagoya Protocol is the most important of these. Um, it's called the Nagoya Protocol on Access to Genetic Resources and the Fair and Equitable Sharing of Benefits Arising from the Utilization. Right? So it was adopted in Nagoya, Japan, and that hence the name. Right? So the core elements of Nagoya Protocol is that it has three types of obligations. One is the access obligation, one is the benefit sharing obligation, and the compliance obligations. So these are the core elements of the protocol. This is just for your information. So, right. So any queries? Moving on to the next question. HE targets are related to dash conservation of energy, conservation of water, conservation of biodiversity, or none of the above. Any answers? We have one answer. Okay, we have a couple of answers, and both of you are right. So the HE targets are actually pertaining to conservation of biodiversity. So the answer is C. So these targets actually there are 20 targets in total, and they are categorized under 5 strategic goals, right? So these are a list of the targets in case somebody is curious. Right? So Okay, so those were questions from the previous runs assignment questions. Any major queries regarding this? Else we'll move on to a very brief outline of what strategic environmental assessment is, and then to current assignment questions. All right. So this question was sort of brought up in a couple of the previous live sessions actually. So I'm addressing it here.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much for bringing this topic.
Yeah. Okay.
I was actually demanded it. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Okay. Oh, thank you. I'm glad you're here. I was hoping that you'll be here, right? So I had actually realized this would need clarification because several of the weeks have actually pointed out to this word SEA, right? Including in the current uh, set of lectures. I think this was lecture 17 and SEA was mentioned. Okay. So let's see a bit about how it came up and then we'll understand what it is essentially. So environmental impact assessment usually assesses and predicts the likely impacts of a specific development project. So, right, on the environment and natural ecosystem. So this is the keyword for EIA, right? We have one project and then we look at what all impacts it can have. It also ensures, because it does this, it ensures that there is enough environmental monitoring and management plans at various stages of a project again. So it's for one project, making sure it's complying to environmental, uh, having some form of environmental consideration. But over time, what happened was people started noticing that there were several gaps that were forming, and this led to the advancement of another process, which is very similar to EIA. However, the difference happens here. So around 1980s, what happened was some countries started to develop guidelines, procedures, and laws envisaging environmental assessment of the policies, plans, programs, and legislative acts. So instead of assessing the project, we start assessing the existing policies, plans, programs, and acts, or proposed policies, plans, programs, and acts. Right. So we start analyzing uh, legislation itself, the acts itself, are they environmentally, sound? So this sort of led to the formation of strategic environmental assessment. So basically, it is taking it to higher tiers of action, right? So the primary task in the strategic environmental assessment is to analyze the proposed acts, policies, plans, programs, or other strategic plans of the government or an institutional body. So it can be any body, right? Through an environmental window before the implementation stage again. So before we actually go ahead and implement some form of policy or a plan or some act, we take stock of how is it going to affect the environment. So I think this will again clarify what
Ma'am, yeah, sorry, taking your permission.
yeah,
So
yeah.
could you
So
please
what
also give a small example of exact the existing EIA and another similar example of giving a example of this strategic environment impact one.
yeah. So
So given clear, with this dimension.
yeah, so like just take a look at, like, of course it happens at the policy formulation stage itself, right? So let's say I'm going to take a very very simple example. Say an organization wants to provide, and again it's an extremely simple example. I'm sorry for the elementary level of it, right? So say there is a company, there is an organization that wants to provide some free toothpaste to a particular community. Why are they doing this? So this is something that happened in my father's life. So it just came to my mind. Like it's the easiest example that I'm getting. Why did they want to do this? So the company has a policy. It's an industry, and it's doing a lot of harm to its immediate environment, right? So the company had wanted to sort of better the lives of people around it. So that is part of their policy, right? So in that policy, what happened was, so the policy of the company is social welfare, right? Like apart from manufacturing and all, let's do something for the society. That is the policy, right? So how are they operationalizing the policy? Operationalizing as in how are they putting it to action, right? What did they do? They decided to give toothpaste to the local community, like, supply it like monthly, like they went door to door and gave it. So, however, so this happened years ago. They like the local people sort of realized the local people were actually fisheries and sort of not very educated. They were aware of things, but it so happens that the toothpaste that was given by the company to the localites actually had very, very high levels of fluoride. It was actually very harmful to the society and environment as such, like because of course the fluoride is going to go off into biomagnification, going off into water. Everything was happening. So this was identified and it was stopped, right? So say the company sort of mm, wants to formulate this policy itself at the policy level. When they are outlining it, say they decide, okay, I want to do welfare for the local community. What all is it? How all is it going to affect? Say they end up giving, say, they're thinking of giving freebies. It's going to lead to a lot of waste. It's going to lead to a transformation of lifestyle. It's going to affect the local community. All of this is something that they need to take care of when the policy itself is designed, right? Or say they decide that, okay, you know what, I'm going to make sure that the security of the place is increased. So some sort of policy, this can be at the government's level, at a company level, right, or an institution level, right? So at that stage, if we do this impact assessment, that's called an SEA. But in a particular project, say you are developing a bus stand, or you are developing some sort of infrastructure project, you're going to do a particular project, it's called an EIA. It's as simple as that, right? I hope that clarifies. Yeah, yes, please go ahead, Mr. Rizal.
Yes, ma'am. Just for a better understanding, I'd
Yes,
like to share one example so that you can clarify my doubt
yes,
here. For an example, in a road, on a road construction program,
right.
highway. So the NHAI is the client. They
Mm,
are constructing this road.
mm,
Now, here, what would be the strategic environmental assessment
okay.
here
So,
in this
huh,
scenario?
this is actually, now that you ask, it's easier for me to explain. So, them constructing a road in a particular village, say they're doing it in your village or your city, that's going to be EIA. They will look at how the particular community is going to be affected, etc. Right? However, the NHAA has a policy. They think I need to build roads. That's their policy, right? So at
Yes,
that level, what is building of roads going to do to society? Like it won't be a particular village. In general, what is road building going to do? Do we need to build roads? At that level, like building of roads is going to affect the environment positively also. Say we'll improve the economy, so the capacity of a particular place will go up. So all of these will also happen, but it could also mean that excessive pollution because vehicles might be moving around. So at that level, do we need more roads or not? So when the NHA decides to build more roads at that level, that policy, say they were about to implement the golden quadrilateral. Do we need this or not? That is an SEA, strategic environmental assessment. Right? And then when they are actually building the golden quadrilateral, say near Chennai, they had this particular area where they're going to, evacuate so many people. That is environment impact assessment. Is that clear?
yes,
Yeah.
better.
Yeah.
I
I,
am. Thank you so much.
yeah. All right. So I think I'll share this in the discussion forum as well because I hope
Please,
that
ma'am.
clears it. Yes. Thank you.
Yes, yes.
So moving on to it, do any others have any queries regarding this? All right. So let's move on to the current assignment question. So most of these are actually overlaps from the previous run. So we are only going to look at the questions that are non-overlap. Right? Or rather, which institute is responsible for management of resources in the coastal water? Nodal ministry with major responsibility for protecting marine environment includes implementation of legislative measures. I think we saw this earlier today. Yes, both of you are right. The answer is A. So this is again from the set of slides, right? The answer is A. It's the Ministry of Environment and Forests. Right now, it's the Ministry of Environment and Forests and Climate Change. Okay, moving on to the next question. Which CRZ area is known as intertidal zone? Is it CRZ 1B, CRZ 2A, 1A, or 2B? Okay, we have one answer. CRZ is Coastal Regulation Zone. Okay. Okay. Okay, the answer is actually, so you are right. The answer is 1B, right? Intertidal areas. Again, you'll have to remember these. So this is something that will help you sort of remember the entire thing, right? So in 2011, the coastal regulation zone notification actually had just 5 categories. It was CRZ 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the no development zone, right? So, however, each of these were sort of split into several categories. So, CRZ 1 earlier was eco-sensitive and intertidal areas. Now it's eco-sensitive areas as well as intertidal areas. So it's CRZ 1A and 1B split into two, right? Two CRZ 2 was areas which have been developed up to or close to the shore, right? So that has been retained. It's the same. So CRZ 3 previously was areas that are relatively undisturbed and do not fall under CRZ 1 or CRZ 2. But right now, CRZ 3 sort of has specific density specifications, right? CRZ 3 areas where the population is more than, so basically CRZ 3 areas as in those that do not fall under 1 or 2, right? That are relatively undisturbed, but the population density is more than 2161 people per square kilometer as per 2011 census. Then CRZ 3B is when the density is less than 2160. So CRZ 4 area between low tide line and 12 nautical miles into the sea. So this is the area. So CRZ 4A has 12 nautical miles from the low tide lines towards the sea. And there is a new category here, CRZ 4B, which is tidal influenced water bodies. So there are certain rivers or stretches of rivers or some form of backwaters and maybe even certain lakes which are influenced by, tidally, as in because of marine environments, right? Because of being too close to the coast. So NDZ is no development zone that extends up to 200 meters from the high tide line towards the land in CRZ3 area. However, right now it's 50 meters from high tide line in CRZ3A areas and 200 meters from high tide line in CRZ3B 3B areas, which is sort of, so this reduction has been widely contested. So people are like, so why would you reduce it from 200 meters? So this has been the focus of quite a bit of controversy actually. Right? So any queries? So you'll have to remember these. These have been given in the slide. So, so moving on to the next question. How many biospheres were established by the government of India in the country uh, based on categories relating to IUCN? So the answer is actually 18. So let's take a look at, so we saw sanctuaries, we saw reserves, we saw protected areas, we saw conservation areas, community reserves, conservation reserves, national parks, whatnot. So, sort of, summing up all of this, this is like a conceptual framework. Mind you, it's not very rigid. So, it's a conceptual framework. So, whenever it comes to biodiversity conservation, we have two approaches. One can be in situ. In situ is on site. Ex situ is off site, right? In there is, say, there is an endangered species. I'm going to draw this endangered species here. And you sort of retain it in its environment and you protect this entire environment. That's in situ, right? Or when you take this out and then say you keep it in a zoo, right? Then that's ex situ, right? You're taking it out of sight, that's ex situ. You're keeping it on site and protecting the entire site, that's in situ. So this is again a conceptual term, right? So in situ approaches include national parks, wildlife sanctuaries. Sacred groves, sacred lakes are sort of these patches or areas which are actually considered sacred by certain communities and therefore are automatically, protected. Right? But within biosphere reserves, we have this is what we're going to look at right now. So ex situ, you have these botanical gardens, zoos, etc. Coming to biosphere reserves, they are basically areas to protect larger areas of natural habitat. These areas are larger than a typical national park or an animal sanctuary, right? So they usually include one or more national parks or reserves, along with buffer zones that are open to some economic. So if you remember, these are called the reserves, right? Like the community reserve or the conservation reserve. These are the buffer zones or other some other form of buffer zone, some restricted development happening, national parks or reserves, right? So all of this could be part of a biosphere reserve. Okay? So protection is granted not only to flora and fauna, as in the animals and the plant species, but also to human communities who inhabit these regions and their ways of life. So these are the indigenous communities. So say you have a core area. In the core area, so these are the types of activities that are permissible, right? In the core area, only research is permissible. No other, activity is permissible in the core area. It's absolutely protected. But in the buffer area around this, you can sort of have education or training activities, as well as some form of tourism also happens. And usually in the transition area between the buffer area and outside, it's mostly just tourism or recreation activities, right? So at the international level, the World Network of Biosphere Reserves is sort of under the Man and the Biosphere program of UNESCO. So there are 727 biosphere reserves across the globe which are which have been recognized under this network of biosphere reserves. Uh, the number of indigenous people who are living in these reserves, like we said, is 275 million people. Right? So they are spread across 131 countries. This is just a bit of, basic trivia. Right? So yes, please, is there a question?
Yeah, madam, any ideas? India में कितने हैं? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
how
coming,
many?
coming, coming, coming.
All right.
So the World Network of Biosphere Reserves is actually themed in two ways, right? One is the regional and inter-regional networks. As in, we talk about there are sub-networks within broader regions. Excuse me, like Africa, Arab states, Asia and the Pacific, Europe and North America, Latin America, and the Caribbean, Portugal and Spain, as well as ecosystem specific networks. So we have a network of drylands, or this is a particular type of biosphere reserve, right? Mangroves, marine, coastal, and island area. Like so, this is an example of a regional statistic, right? And this is for a particular type of biosphere. So 435 out of the 727 biosphere reserves are mountainous regions. These are just some interesting values. So these are the biosphere reserves in India. So that's the current list. We have 18 of them. This is from the Ministry of Environment and forest and climate change. Right, so you see this asterisk mark. So not all of the biosphere reserves that have been declared in India come under this world, network of biosphere reserves. Only 12 of them are under this world network. 8 of them are not part of that, right? So, for example, Manas or Dibru-Saikhowa, all of these do not actually come under the biosphere reserves, rather the global network of biosphere reserves. All right. So these are details of some of the key fauna, key flora that you find in these reserves. So let's take a slightly closer look at one of the reserves, just to illustrate some of the aspects that we have discussed about reserves, right? So this is the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve. If you can see, it's sort of part of Wayanad, Nagarhole, Bandipur, and Mudumalai. These are Nilambur, Silent Valley, and Sirvani Hills. So these are across Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and Karnataka, the states of these three states, and they're in the Western Ghats, right? So this is a map of the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve. If you see this uh, illustration sort of outlines the core area where all the dark green areas where almost only research activities permitted, no other sort of activities permitted. Here they marked it as manipulation. Manipulation as in basically these are buffer zones, right? So where forestry is happening, some form of reforestation or organized forestry is happening. Then the beige or the light yellow areas are where tourism is permitted. However, it will be restricted tourism, like eco-friendly tourism, not very destructive ones. So, to those of you who are familiar with the region, this is where Ooty is, right? So, Ooty, if you see, has been marked off as not part of the reserve, right? So, the reserve sort of goes around Ooty. Then pink areas where is where other forms of restoration is actively happening. So they're trying to sort of restore the biospheric capacity. Right? As we noticed, as we already noted, the biosphere reserves could actually be home to several types of areas, such as national parks. You can this one has the Mudumalai Tiger Reserve here, and then there are wildlife sanctuaries which are part of this biosphere reserve, and there are other the other biosphere reserve areas are here. So you see how these can all be part of one larger biosphere reserve, right? And you can also see how they are home to several indigenous communities. So, and this is sort of a map depicting how they are distributed across the biosphere, right? And they are also essentially protected. So, this is an example of an indigenous community that's part of the biosphere reserve. These are the Todas that are part of the Nilgiri biosphere reserve. In fact, they've sort of become part of the mainstream culture as well, where because of their unique style of clothing and their like in general styling, they've also all been mainstreamed and sort of made part of pop culture, right? And that's one of their religious structures. So if you again are familiar, if you go to the top of the botanical gardens in Ooty, you can actually go meet some of them, right? So they've sort of become very familiar, very accustomed to people coming in and being curious. Uh, they're not that sealed off from the rest of the this particular village, that is. Right? So any queries? All right. So moving on to the next question. Which country has not taken part in the project Natural Capital Accounting and Valuation of the Ecosystem Services? Is it Brazil, China, India, or the USA? Okay. Okay, this is actually basically from this slide, right? So there are 5 countries that are taking part in this project. It's called the NCAVES project. That will be India, Brazil, China, South Africa, and Mexico. I mean, I know it's very usual for us to assume that China might not be into this, but if you remember, they're actually, actively taking part in the GES approach, right? They sort of came up with it in fact. So, yeah, so the answer is actually USA. They are not part of the project. All right. So, with that, we sort of come to the end of this session. I hope that was useful. Any queries? Any queries? Any general queries regarding? I hope this format of the live sessions are actually okay with all of you, where we look at questions and then we look at answers and then we sort of build on the content, right? And in case you have any other queries that you would like to bring in, or in general, or you want me to address a particular topic, like we saw SEA, right? Like if you want any readdressing anything, you can just put across a request here or in the discussion forum. It will be, addressed.
Sure, ma'am. If it is possible to email or text, uh, whichever you are comfortable?
So you can post it in the discussion forum, but not even otherwise. I think I can actually. I don't mind giving my. Uh,
Yeah, please give your phone
yeah,
number.
yeah. I'll give my mail ID. Right? Right?
Fine.
That's okay. Yeah. One second. So that is my mail ID in the chat box, right? So yeah, in case you have any requests, you can send it across. But if there are no other queries, I think we'll close off the session. To those of you who would like to, because this keeps coming up, um, all the videos, all the slides of these sessions are actually accessible on the course homepage. If you look at the bottom left corner of your homepage, you can actually see problem solving session, right? So under that tab, if you click on the option that comes up, it says click here for to view the problem solving session lectures. So that leads to an Excel sheet where there is a full list of all the videos, all the slides. You can access all of them from the course page. And a recording of this session is available on YouTube as well. All right, then if there's no other queries, I think we'll close the session.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.